I'm Daniel Schuman, Policy Counsel with the Sunlight Foundation, and I'm also the Director of the Advisory Committee. I'd like to thank you all for trekking over on this very hot and very busy Tuesday afternoon. I appreciate it. Just to go over briefly, the Advisory Committee's purpose is to support the efforts of the Congressional Transparency Caucus, whose mission is to make the government more open and transparent. And the Advisory Committee will be supporting the caucus's efforts in two ways. One is by providing education and resources to congressional staff on transparency issues, and the second way is helping to make connections between congressional staff and experts. The Advisory Committee is a project of the Sunlight Foundation, and more information is available at transparencycaucus.org. Although the Advisory Committee is new, today's event is in some ways a continuation of a series of roundtable discussions that have taken place over the last couple years. Particularly focused on transparency issues, and we're trying to just sort of move the ball forward on that and get more folks involved and raise its profile a little bit. While most congressional briefings take place in private, we, in an effort to be as open as possible, have posted online all of the background materials that you'll also find on your chairs, and we will publish video of the speakers' presentations. At the same time, because staffers need prior authorization to speak publicly about work-related issues, and we want to encourage everybody in this room to engage in conversation and collaboration, the discussion after these short presentations will be off the record. Today we'll be speaking about three different topics. One is contractor oversight, the second is access to congressional ethics information, and finally we will speak about access to federal court records. These topics are related insofar as they concern public access to government-generated documents, and also that small changes in policy in these areas would have a tremendous effect. Our first speaker today is to my right. It's Scott Amery, General Counsel with the Project on Government Oversight, or POGO, which is an independent nonprofit organization that exposes government corruption and other forms of misconduct. He directs POGO's contractor oversight investigations, and he'll be speaking on that issue today. Bill Allison, who is the Sunlight Foundation's editorial director, was delayed at the last moment and won't be able to attend. So I will be speaking in his place. He's a little bit taller than I am, and I think he has better hair, so I will do the best that I can to do an accurate impression both of the style and of Bill's substance. And to my left is Harlan Yu, a PhD candidate affiliated with Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy. He helped develop FedThread, which is an online resource that helps the public monitor rules and regulations published in the Federal Register. It is incredibly helpful. He also helped develop Recap, which is an online application that helps make available court records at no cost. Recap, by the way, if you spell it backwards, is PACER, which is how you can access federal court records online but for a fee. And he will be speaking about that issue generally. So I think I'd like to start with Scott, if you could just give us a brief overview of contractor oversight issues in FAPIS and all the acronym and acrobat soup. That would be much appreciated. Scott.
We probably don't need these microphones, but I'll put it on anyway so the camera, I guess, picks it up. The Project on Government Oversight has been around since 1981. We started out as the Project on Military Procurement, and eventually back in the mid-90s we switched over and decided to look at the entire federal government. And the old saying is we investigate and expose waste, fraud, and abuse, and then we work with people up here on the Hill and in executive branch agencies to remedy those, to come up with solutions and do our best then to put them forth. Please.
I'm just going to interrupt for a moment. Would you please like to come up and say a few words, please? Hi, welcome.
Hi.
Daniel Schuman. It's good to see you again.
Hi, Harlan. Hi.
Please, you're welcome. Have a seat.
Sure. I have a few minutes. We're getting briefed as we speak on Chairman Tierney's analysis of Afghanistan and how things are transported through the country using warlords, apparently. So it's all part of the transparency thing. Mostly I want to thank my staff and everybody who's participated so far in getting the Transparency Caucus going. I know we have other things planned, including hopefully moving our legislation, the Transparency Act. Again, many of you were involved with my staff, so we appreciate that very much. just about everything that's happening right now, people are talking about how it would be better if there was greater transparency and accountability, from the wars, the hearing I'm going to right now, to the Gulf of Mexico, and what we should have known and when we should have known that. So I'd like to think that coming from the state of Illinois, this seems obvious, right? 2 trials going on at the same time, literally across the street from each other, changing the face of Illinois politics. But the best we can do is try to bring it back here from D.C., make those actions in Chicago and across the country. So we appreciate what you're doing. Sorry I can't stay really long, but my crack staff, that's Lindsay there, Matisse, legislative director, will be here while we go get briefed on Chairman Tierney's 6-month analysis of what's taking place in Afghanistan. So again, thank you very much. I think, Mr. Isa been here yet?
No, he's over on the Senate side.
Stop by as well. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Alrighty. We'll be in touch.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for stopping by. Sure.
Thanks.
And what Representative Quigley's talking about is the fact that there's no subcontractor data, and that's one of the problems with the transparency in contracting right now. And so in Afghanistan especially, we're hearing that a lot of private security contractors are hiring Afghan home country nationals to do a lot of their guard service work and support the U.S. efforts and other countries' efforts in supporting our troops and the contractors that are there, in performing both military missions as well as working for the Department of State and USAID. And what they're finding out is a lot of the money that's being given to these subcontractors is actually then being used to, in essence, just pay warlords not to go after their convoys, which then they are taking the next leap in an assumption that that money then is being used then to help fund the war against us. So in essence, it's a great hearing that Tierney, Representative Tierney is actually having today, and so I'm actually glad Representative Quigley was only able to stop in, because I think that's a great place for him to be to ask the right questions. And that's the problem. When it comes to government contracting, there's not a lot of information out there. Who in this room has tried to find an offer or a bid online? Have you been successful? It's very difficult. How about a contract online? Have you been successful in finding it? No, and that's one of the problems. You can get some summary data if you know how to use these databases, and you have the right information going into it, but then even then, you only get a summary of that contract with some coded numbers, some dates, some amounts of money that have been obligated, received, spent, and then you end up with some addresses and phone numbers, and that's about it. And so that's one of the things POGO and Sunlight Foundation and many others in Washington, D.C. are trying to do is, let's get all that contract data put online. Let's get the contract put online. Let's stop just assuming what the government is hiring, what goods we're buying, or what services that we're paying for. Let's really get to the meat and potatoes. What are we buying? What are the timelines? What are the performance awards? How are we spending over $500 billion in taxpayer dollars on federal contracts? And then when it comes to subcontract data, there's actually no data. And that's one of the things, because the government doesn't have privity, doesn't have a link to the subcontractor because it runs through a prime. And in essence, now we're hearing that there's multiple layers of subcontractors out there. There's a first layer, but we're hearing 4th and 5th tier subcontractors out there. The government doesn't have any relationship with those. So for this hearing that's taking place today, it's very difficult for the government to even know who is actually being paid to do the work, and that's problematic. And so one of the ways that we've tried to actually improve the system is we are pushing to get all contracts online. But also in the contractor accountability world, POGO years ago has been pushing for a federal contractor misconduct or responsibility database. And back in 2008, we were able to get a law passed. It was part of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2009. President Bush somehow signed it, and so that was wonderful. And now it's trickled down through the regulatory process, and finally the final rule came out, I think it was in March, And the new database is called FAPIS, the Federal Awardee Performance Integrity and Information System, FAPIIS. And that database is created to list criminal, civil, and administrative fines and penalties and settlements, suspensions, debarments, contracts terminated for default, for instances that are linked to federal contracts. The problem, though, with that database is it's not publicly available. Who here is from a committee staff? So we have 2, 3, 4. So at that point, you guys may have access to it, because the way that the law is written, it says that access is only provided to the ranking member and the chair. So you guys may want to start poking around FAPIS, but everyone else, other than those 4 staffers, currently won't have access to it without permission from, I think, the OMB administrator. So it may be something you even want to ask about. There was a provision in there to make it publicly available, and it was stripped out. It was stripped out both in the House version and then the Senate version, and there was one staffer that went on record to say, well, you know, we don't need a one-stop shop on all this information combined together, because the fortunate thing for us is a lot of the information in that database is already publicly available. There's certain information that is included in it, performance information, that is considered protected proprietary information, and therefore that is not publicly available in some other databases. But for the most part, the excluded parties list, you can go to epls.gov and see all the contractors who have been or are suspended or debarred. You can go to DOJ or U.S. Attorney pages and find out who's had some kind of civil, criminal, or administrative penalty lodged against them. You can go to OSHA records. You can go to the Department of Labor. There are many, different parts of that database that the information is publicly available. Now, to show you kind of the uphill battle that we're up against is, I sat in on a briefing at the ABA, and the ABA, usually the people that attend that meeting are made up of all the lawyers that represent the contractors, so I'm always not the most popular person at those types of meetings. But they just gave a presentation on FAPIS, dated June 10th, and it says practicalities and industry implementation, and it says other issues to ponder, and it says how to minimize what is reportable. No acknowledgement of fault in the settlement or agreement, and then it goes on and kind of tells you about what to do, with whistleblower actions, prime sub disputes. Mark all FAPIS information proprietary and confidential to strengthen argument that material is exempt from disclosure under FOIA. Well, although I don't have access to the database offhand, I have FOIA'd the database. The database actually went into effect on April 23rd. So on April 23rd, the Project on Government Oversight turned around and sent a Freedom of Information Act request into the GSA, who recently responded and said, well, you also have to go to the Department of Defense and ask for information. And they turned around, so I FOIA'd it. Well, they know, and then Pogo's name was mentioned mentioned during this presentation, that there's an effort to backdoor the information that's not supposed to be publicly available through FOIA. Right after that was mentioned, then they also mentioned the fact that there are many pieces of legislation up here on the Hill that are trying to get FAPIS to be publicly available. And even in the defense authorization, did it make the defense authorization, the House version? I don't think so. I think there's some standalone bills that are floating around to make FAPIS publicly available, but the industry seems to not be supportive of that effort. And from what we're hearing, they're putting a lot of pressure on OMB to also oppose making FAPIS publicly available. So it's somewhat at odds with the Open Government Initiative and directive that the Obama administration has put out. Also his stance on FOIA and putting the burden on agencies to not disclose information rather than just hiding it and making information publicly available. So long story short is we're kind of having an uphill battle even with the White House on making this database public. And in an effort to do that, Pogo and 15 other organizations, including Sunlight, just sent up here to the Hill a letter, and it's part of the materials that are listed, and if anybody would like me to email them, a sign-on letter from bipartisan groups asking that a Senate amendment to an appropriations bill make it through conference, and that would make FAPIS publicly available, all but the performance information that has been deemed proprietary. So there are efforts going on to do our best from the outside, but that's where we also need some congressional assistance to help push those things over the top and get them signed into law so that we don't have opposition over at OMB and they're kind of forced to do it. So I'll stop there and be happy to answer any specific questions that you have.
Great, thank you so much, Scott. This will be something that we will be discussing with all of you shortly. More information about making contractor oversight something that the public can engage in, as well as just certain select folks. Now, as I mentioned before, Bill Allison, because of a last-minute conflict, wasn't able to be here, so I will be speaking in his place. I'm Daniel Schuman with the Sunlight Foundation, and also director of the Advisory Committee on Transparency. So I ask that you press me as I make these points, but not too hard because I don't have all of the fine-grained details at my fingertips. So what I'm going to speak about is access to congressional ethics information. There's a lot of material that is required both by the House and Senate rules to be publicly available. They are maintained on the House side by the House Clerk's Office and on the Senate side by the Senate Office of Public Records. But if you've ever had the experience of trying to get your hands on these documents, it's not as easy as you would think. First of all, you can't get them online for the most part, with the exception of a handful of, with the exception of lobbying disclosure information. Most of these documents, you need to go to the basement of the Cannon Building or into the Hart Building on the Senate side and go and request the documents. Now, they are stored in an electronic format, but don't bring your thumb drive, don't bring a CD-ROM, because they will not give it to you in electronic format. The only way to obtain these files is to pay, I think it's 7 or 8 cents a page, and print every single one of them out. This can take hours and costs a significant amount of money. In the electronic age, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Now, some of these records, of course, all of these records have already been decided that they should be publicly available. But what we're seeing here is sort of a practical obscurity, that the reality is that it's very, very hard to get. Our colleagues over at another organization, they go through this very process. They print out the documents. It takes them 3 or 4 months to input all of the data, and then they release information as to personal financial disclosure forms for members of Congress. This is just one example of the many different types of information that's available in these documents. Other examples include, so let's say that you're a member of Congress and you're retiring. If you start negotiating for another job, or you enter an agreement for another job after your time in Congress ends, you're required to file a form which is it's called a post-employment negotiation form. And then when you have a conflict of interest that arises, you have to file a second form, which is, I think it's called a conflict of interest form or some variation thereof, which then causes that first form to be made publicly available. So now, okay, now you know this particular member has a conflict because they're negotiating to work for Halliburton and they're working on the defense committee or something along those lines. But of course, how would you find out that this document is now publicly available? The answer is, if you call and you say, what's become publicly available? The answer is you actually have to come down and take a look. And of course, if you want to make these documents available online, you have to scan them yourselves and put them online. There are a number of examples of documents along these lines. Now, the Senate does a fairly decent job of cataloging them. There's 10 or 15 or so. And they publish a book that's available to staff, which we happen to have, and we've made it available online. The House, at least as far as I can tell, doesn't have a similar catalog of these ethics documents. Now, at a minimum, people should be able to know before they have to come to the Hill as to what public documents are available. It would make sense if these documents are available in electronic form, which many of them are, either in a database or in PDF, that you should be able to obtain them in their electronic form and not have to pay to print them out, to type them in, to turn them into a database. So I'm sure that Bill would be able to say this much more eloquently than I am. He's gone through this exercise many more times than I have. But having done it at least a couple of times, it's certainly worth considering, one, what information should be disclosed? Is there other information besides what's in these ethics reports that should be publicly available? The nature of how they're made publicly available. One thing that the House has done very well recently, and the Senate will be doing soon, is they've taken the House expenditure reports and soon the Senate expenditure reports and are making them available online so you can see all sorts of different kinds of things. So for example, recently an analysis of the House expenditure reports, I think it was by roll call, revealed that CAO was spending an inordinate amount of money on temps. It is unclear why they were spending so much money on temps, but they had a conversation with the committee that was responsible for doing oversight, and had changed the threshold requirement for reporting above the level which spending on temp staff salaries would be reported. So the Oversight Committee would have no idea whatsoever that they were spending all these money on temporary employees. Now, this could point to a number of things. Maybe they're having trouble retaining staff. Maybe they're just having trouble hiring staff. Maybe, the possibilities here are endless, but without proper disclosure in this particular facet, there is no way that the Oversight Committee would have been able to find out what was going on. And with that, we will talk about this a little bit more in a couple minutes. And I'd like to introduce Harlan Yu, who will be speaking about access to federal court records. Harlan.
Thanks, Daniel. And thanks to Representatives Quigley and Issa for chairing the Transparency Caucus and for the Advisory Committee on Transparency for inviting me here to speak with you today. I'm here to discuss public access to federal court records. And certainly for this audience, it shouldn't be necessary to discuss at length why court documents are so fundamental to our democracy. In almost all circumstances, ignorance of the law is no excuse for breaking the law. And so one would assume that the law of our land, and in this case, the documents that form the basis of our common law, would be freely available and accessible, without discrimination, to each and every citizen who wishes to learn her civic rights and responsibilities. But today, this is not the case. Today, access to the law and to justice itself is discriminatory. It is biased toward the wealthy, to those who can afford access to primary legal materials. Let me explain. The U.S. courts runs an online access system called PACER, which stands for Public Access to Court Electronic Records. It provides real-time online access to information about all federal district, bankruptcy, and appellate court proceedings. The system charges users 8 cents per page, where a page is effectively defined as a screen full of data. If a user searches for a case with a defendant named Smith, which returns 10 pages of results, he will be charged 80 cents, 8 cents per page. If he then accesses a case docket sheet, he might be charged an additional 40 cents for those 5 pages. And a subsequent download of a single 20-page brief will cost him yet another $1. And while at first this might not seem like a lot of money, it is. It adds up fast. And for many users, PACER's paywall is, if not extremely limiting, fully prohibitive. In a survey conducted last year by Erica Wayne at Stanford's Law School, she found that even at our nation's top law schools, a vast majority of their libraries restrict direct access to PACER by their own students and faculty. What they're deathly afraid of is an unexpected and huge PACER bill. For instance, one Stanford student last year, in a matter of hours, ran up a $500 tab while doing legitimate legal research. As a result, almost all law schools around the country ration their PACER usage. Legal scholars wishing to shed light systematically and empirically on the inner workings of our legal system as a whole are effectively shut out as well. The PACER repository contains over 500 million documents. And for a project that requires analyzing a large portion of these documents, a fee of 8 cents per page quickly puts an end to the idea of conducting that research. So too harmed are nonprofits, investigative journalists, pro se litigants, and other concerned citizens with an interest in our judicial system. So you might be asking, why are the courts allowed to charge for access to the public record? Their authority comes from the E-Government Act of 2002, which specifies that the Judicial Conference may prescribe reasonable fees for electronic access to court records, but, and I quote, only to the extent necessary. The purpose of the fees is to, quote, reimburse expenses incurred in providing these services. There's substantial evidence that the courts have been far overstepping their statutory limitation. My colleague at Princeton, Stephen Schultz, has been voracious in his investigation into the finances of the federal judiciary as it relates to PACER. I would highly recommend reading his recent blog post and his white paper on the topic. In short, the courts are charging users at least 4 times as much as it costs to run the PACER system. Their budget documents for fiscal year 2010 show that they expect to collect more than $94 million in PACER fees this year, even though only $21 million are direct expenses for providing electronic public access. This $73 million difference this year, along with carryover revenue from previous years, total more than $100 million, which are then used to fund other technology projects, courtroom technologies like flat screen monitors, and general telecommunications expenditures, which are not directly related to electronic public access. I'm not opposed to these projects, but they shouldn't come at the expense of free and open access to the law. So what can Congress do? It's really simple. Repeal the language from the 2002 E-Government Act that allows the courts to levy user fees for electronic public access, and in turn, prohibit them from charging for this information. There will be some practical difficulties to doing so, to be sure, but repealing the statutory authority with appropriate sunset provisions will get the right gears turning. We can discuss specific considerations in our conversation to follow. But to conclude, I'd like to quote from the Senate report that accompanied the 2002 E-Government Act. It noted that the committee intends to encourage the Judicial Conference to move from a fee structure in which electronic docketing systems are supported primarily by user fees to a fee structure in which this information is freely available to the greatest extent possible. For far too long, access to the crown jewels of the public domain have been artificially restricted to the detriment of our society and our democracy. Now is the time to free these documents and to provide our citizens with equal unfettered access to justice and to the law. Thanks.